At 79, I never imagined that I would be sitting at the edge of my bed, holding an empty velvet jewelry box in my hands, trying to understand how something so small could carry the weight of an entire lifetime. And as I ran my fingers along the worn lining where my wedding ring and mother's necklace had once rested, I felt a quiet stillness settle over me, not the kind that brings peace, but the kind that arrives when something inside you realizes that what has been lost is not just an object, but a piece of trust you never thought would be broken. The room around me was exactly as I had left it that morning, the curtains half drawn, the soft light filtering through in that familiar way that had always made the space feel calm and steady, and yet everything felt different now, as though the absence of those few pieces of jewelry had shifted something far deeper than their physical presence, and I didn't realize it at the time. But this moment was not just about what was missing. It was about what had been quietly taken from me without my knowing. I had always kept those pieces in the same place, tucked carefully into that small box, not because they were particularly valuable in the way people often measure such things, but because they carried meaning, memories that could not be replaced, reminders of a life that had unfolded over decades, and I had trusted that they would remain there, untouched, just as they always had, because in a home filled with family, there are certain things you believe are understood without needing to be said. But that wasn't the worst part. What unsettled me most, even in those first moments, was not the loss itself, but the quiet realization that this had not been an accident, that someone had opened that box, had made a decision, had taken something that did not belong to them, and had done so with the understanding that I would eventually notice. And that thought lingered in my mind with a weight I could not easily set aside. My grandson, Ethan, had been staying with me for several months by then, ever since he told me he needed a place to get back on track, and I welcomed him without hesitation, because that is what you do for family, especially when they come to you not with pride but with quiet uncertainty, and I believed, perhaps too easily, that offering him stability would help him find his footing again. He had always been a bright boy, thoughtful in his younger years, the kind who would sit beside me and ask questions about things most children overlooked, and I remember thinking, even then, that he carried a sensitivity that would serve him well in life, but over time, that sensitivity seemed to fade into something more restless, more uncertain. And while I noticed the changes, I told myself they were simply part of growing up, part of finding one's place in a world that does not always make that easy. In the months he had been with me, there had been small signs that things were not as steady as he claimed, moments where he avoided certain questions, times when he seemed distracted or distant, and I didn't realize it at the time. But those moments were not isolated. They were pieces of something I had chosen not to fully examine, because doing so would have meant questioning a trust I wasn't ready to doubt. That morning had felt ordinary, just like any other, and I had gone about my routine without a second thought, never imagining that by afternoon I would be sitting there, holding that empty box, trying to make sense of something that no longer fit within the version of my life I had been holding on to. And if someone had told me then what this moment would lead to, I would have dismissed it gently, the way you do when something feels too painful to consider. But what happened next changed everything, though I didn't yet understand it fully. And as I sat there, the quiet weight of that realization settling deeper into my chest, a thought began to form, one that felt both fragile and undeniable. This was not just about what had been taken. It was about who had taken it, and why. And as I closed that empty jewelry box slowly, my hands steady despite the uncertainty in my mind, I realized that whatever truth lay behind this moment would not reveal itself all at once, but I also knew, with a certainty I could not explain, that I would not confront it blindly, Because sometimes the truth is not something you chase. It is something you wait for quietly until it has no choice but to show itself. I didn't rush to conclusions that afternoon, even though the emptiness of that jewelry box seemed to demand an immediate answer. And instead, I placed it gently back on the dresser, closing the lid with a care that felt almost symbolic, as if I were choosing, at least for that moment, to hold my thoughts in the same quiet way, because I understood that reacting too quickly would only cloud what needed to be seen clearly, and I didn't realize it at the time. But that decision to pause would become one of the most important choices I made. Ethan returned home later that evening, his footsteps familiar as they crossed the hallway, and I listened from my room, not with suspicion, but with a heightened awareness that made every small sound seem more significant than it had before. And when he stepped into the kitchen, calling out casually to let me know he was back, his voice carried the same easy tone it always had, and for a brief moment, I wondered if I had imagined everything, if there was some explanation I had yet to consider. I walked out to meet him, keeping my expression calm, steady, the way I had learned to be over the years when something required observation rather than reaction. And he greeted me with a quick smile, speaking about his day in a way that felt ordinary, almost rehearsed in its normalcy, and I watched him carefully, not just listening to his words, but observing the spaces between them, the small hesitations, the subtle shifts in his posture that might reveal more than what he chose to say. But that wasn't the worst part. What unsettled me most was how natural everything seemed on the surface, how easily he moved through the house, how comfortably he spoke, how nothing in his demeanor suggested that anything had changed. And I realized then that if something had been taken, it had been done with a confidence that assumed it would not be questioned, or at least not immediately, and that thought stayed with me longer than anything else. Over time, as the evening unfolded, I found myself reflecting on the past few weeks, on the small details I had overlooked, the moments that had seemed insignificant at the time, but now felt connected in a way I couldn't ignore, like the way he had started coming home later than usual, the way he would occasionally avoid eye contact when certain topics came up, the way he seemed to carry a quiet restlessness that I had attributed to stress but had never fully examined. I didn't mention the jewelry, not that night, not even in passing, because something inside me told me that this was not a situation that would reveal itself through direct questioning, that whatever truth existed here would require patience, observation, and a willingness to wait longer than felt comfortable. And that kind of waiting is not easy, especially when it involves something so personal. But I understood that clarity often comes to those who allow it the space to unfold. The next morning, I moved through my routine as I always did, making tea, opening the curtains, tending to the small details of the day that had always brought me a sense of calm. And I watched Ethan from a distance as he prepared to leave, noticing how he avoided certain areas of the house, how his movements seemed slightly more deliberate, and I didn't realize it at the time, but those small observations were beginning to form a pattern in my mind. There was a moment, brief but telling, when he glanced toward my room just for a second, as if checking something without fully committing to the action. And while it may have seemed insignificant to anyone else, it stayed with me, because it suggested an awareness, a quiet understanding that something existed there that held his attention, and that thought, though subtle, began to shape the way I saw everything that followed. Over time, I found myself becoming more attentive, not just to him, but to everything around me, the small details that often go unnoticed, the shifts in routine, the changes in behavior, and I began to understand that what I was dealing with was not just a single act, but part of something larger, something that had been building quietly beneath the surface while I chose, perhaps unknowingly, not to look too closely. And as I sat by the window later that day, the sunlight falling softly across the room, I realized that this was no longer just about finding what had been taken. It was about understanding why it had happened, what had led to this moment, and whether the person I believed I knew was still there beneath whatever had changed. And that realization carried a weight that felt both heavy and necessary. Because sometimes the hardest part is not discovering the truth, but deciding what you will do once you see it clearly. The more I allowed myself to observe rather than react, the more the small details began to gather into something I could no longer ignore. And over the next few days, I found myself watching Ethan with a quiet attentiveness that felt almost unfamiliar, not because I had never paid attention to him before, but because this time I was looking without assumptions, without the comfort of trust softening what I saw, and I didn't realize it at the time. But that shift in how I was seeing him would change everything. He moved through the house with the same outward ease, the same casual tone in his voice, the same routines that suggested nothing had changed. And yet, beneath that surface, there were moments that felt just slightly out of place, pauses that lingered a second too long, answers that felt just a bit too quick. And it was in those small inconsistencies that something deeper began to reveal itself. One evening, as we sat together in the living room, he spoke about needing to figure things out, about how things hadn't been going as planned. And I listened carefully, not interrupting, not questioning, simply allowing him to speak. And there was a weight in his words that hadn't been there before, a kind of quiet pressure that suggested he was carrying more than he was willing to say. And I didn't realize it at the time, but that conversation was the first glimpse into something he had been trying to keep hidden. But that wasn't the worst part. What unsettled me most was the growing understanding that whatever he was dealing with, whatever had led him to take something from me, had not happened suddenly. It had been building over time, shaped by choices, circumstances, perhaps even desperation. And that realization made everything more complicated, because it meant I was not just dealing with an act. I was dealing with a situation that had a history I had not fully seen. I began to reflect on the weeks leading up to this moment with a sharper awareness, recalling how he had mentioned money in passing, how he had brushed it off when I asked if everything was all right, how he had assured me that he was managing, and I had accepted those answers without pressing further, because I didn't want to make him uncomfortable, because I believed that giving him space was the right thing to do. And now, sitting with this new understanding, I realized how easily silence can allow something to grow unchecked. Over time, I noticed other small changes. The way he seemed more protective of his belongings, the way he kept his phone close, the way he would step outside to take calls that he once would have taken openly. And while none of these things were proof of anything on their own, together they formed a pattern that was difficult to dismiss, and I felt a quiet certainty beginning to settle in my mind, not loud or dramatic, but steady and undeniable. There was a moment one afternoon when I passed by his room and noticed the door slightly open, and I paused, not out of suspicion, but out of instinct. And inside, I saw him sitting at his desk, looking at something on his phone with a focus that seemed almost tense, and he quickly locked the screen when he noticed me, offering a casual explanation that didn't quite match the urgency of his movement. And though I said nothing, that moment stayed with me longer than I expected. I didn't confront him, not yet, because I understood that what I was seeing needed more than a single question, more than a direct accusation. It required a level of understanding that could only come with time. And so I continued to watch, to listen, to allow the truth to unfold in its own way, even when the waiting felt heavy. And as the days passed, that quiet certainty began to take shape into something more defined, something that no longer felt like a possibility, but like a truth I was slowly coming to accept. And I realized that whatever had happened, whatever he had taken, was not an isolated mistake, but part of something he was struggling with, something he had not been able to face openly. And yet, even with that understanding, there was a question that remained, one that lingered in the quiet spaces of my thoughts, and it was not just about what he had done, but about what I would do next. Because knowing the truth is one thing, but deciding how to respond to it is something else entirely. The weight of knowing, even without full confirmation, began to settle into my days in a way that was both quiet and persistent, and I found myself moving through the house with a deeper awareness, not just of Ethan, but of myself, of how I was choosing to respond, how I was choosing to hold this understanding without letting it overwhelm me, and I didn't realize it at the time. But this space between knowing and acting is where clarity truly begins to take shape. I started to notice how easily life continues, even when something important has shifted beneath it. How routines carry on, conversations unfold, meals are shared. And yet beneath all of it, there is a quiet tension that only you can feel. And I found myself wondering how many people live with that kind of unspoken awareness. How many carry truths they have not yet chosen to confront. And if you have ever felt that quiet weight, then you understand how difficult it is to decide when the time has come to act. Ethan remained the same on the surface, still polite, still attentive in the small ways that suggested he cared, and that made everything more complicated, because it would have been easier if he had become distant or dismissive, easier if there had been something obvious to point to. But instead, there was this contrast between who he had been to me and what I now believed he had done. And that contrast made it harder to reduce the situation to something simple. But that wasn't the worst part. What unsettled me most was how I began to question my own role in all of this, not in a way that placed blame on myself, but in a way that asked whether I had missed something important, whether there had been moments where I could have stepped in, asked more questions, offered more guidance. And I realized that while responsibility for his actions was his alone, understanding the path that led him there required me to look at the whole picture, not just the final moment. One afternoon, as I sat quietly in the living room, I found myself thinking about the jewelry again, not just as objects, but as symbols of something larger, of trust, of memory, of continuity. And I realized that what had been taken from me was not just the items themselves, but the assumption that certain boundaries within a family would never be crossed, and that realization carried a quiet sadness that I could not easily set aside. I began to consider what confrontation would look like, how I might approach it, what I would say, and more importantly, what I wanted to achieve by saying it. And I understood that reacting with anger or accusation might bring a moment of release, but it would not necessarily bring understanding, and I didn't realize it at the time. But I was already beginning to choose a different path, one that required patience rather than immediacy. Over time, that thought began to settle into something more deliberate, and I found myself stepping back even further, observing not just his actions, but the circumstances around them, the patterns in his behavior, the small signs of pressure or stress that might reveal what he was dealing with, and I began to see that whatever had led him to this point was not just about opportunity, but about need, about something he had not been able to resolve in a way that felt right to him. There was a moment later that evening when he sat across from me at the table, quieter than usual, and I could see something in his expression that hadn't been there before, a kind of tension that suggested he was carrying something he could not easily put down, and I realized then that whatever truth I was waiting for, he was already living with it. And as I watched him in that moment, I understood something that shifted everything, something that changed the way I would approach what came next, because this was no longer just about uncovering what had happened. It was about deciding whether I would meet it with confrontation or with something far more powerful. And I didn't yet know exactly what that would be, but I knew with a quiet certainty that had been growing within me that when the time came, I would not act in a way that simply reacted to the moment. I would act in a way that revealed the truth in a way he could not ignore. The decision formed quietly, almost gently, as though it had been waiting for me to reach it, rather than forcing itself upon me. And over the next day or two, I found myself thinking less about whether Ethan had taken the jewelry, and more about how I would choose to respond when the truth finally stood in front of me, because I realized that this was no longer just about confirming what I already suspected. It was about what kind of moment I wanted that confirmation to become. I remember sitting by the window that morning, watching the light move slowly across the floor, and there was a calmness in that moment that felt almost unexpected, because despite everything that had unfolded, I was no longer caught in uncertainty. I was no longer searching for answers. I was preparing, and that shift brought with it a clarity that made everything else seem just a little easier to hold. But that wasn't the most important part. What mattered was the way my thinking began to change, because instead of focusing on the act itself, on the loss, on the betrayal, I began to consider Ethan not as someone who had wronged me, but as someone who had reached a point where he made a choice he could not openly admit. And that perspective did not excuse what had happened, but it allowed me to approach it with something other than anger, something steadier, something that might lead to a deeper understanding. Over time, I began to put small pieces into place, not in a way that was obvious or confrontational, but in a way that created the space for truth to reveal itself. And I made a point of mentioning the jewelry casually one afternoon, not as an accusation, but as a memory, speaking about my mother's necklace and the story behind it, the way it had been passed down, the meaning it carried, and I watched him carefully as I spoke, noticing how his expression shifted just slightly, how his response came a little too quickly, as if he were trying to move past the subject before it settled too deeply. I didn't press further because I understood that this was not the moment for direct questions, not yet, and instead I allowed the conversation to move on naturally, knowing that what I had said would remain with him, that it would sit quietly in his thoughts in a way that direct confrontation might have disrupted, and I didn't realize it at the time. But this was the beginning of something far more effective than accusation. It was the beginning of awareness. Later that evening, I took out the empty jewelry box again, placing it gently on the dresser in plain view, not hidden away as it had been before, and there was something intentional in that placement, not as a signal meant to provoke, but as a quiet presence that could not be ignored, and I left it there, exactly where it could be seen, without explanation, without comment. The next morning, I noticed him pause as he passed by my room, his eyes lingering on the dresser for just a moment longer than necessary, and though he said nothing, that hesitation spoke more clearly than words ever could, and I realized then that the truth was beginning to surface, not through questioning, but through the quiet weight of what could no longer be avoided. Sometimes I wonder how many situations in life are shaped not by what we say, but by what we allow to be seen, how often truth reveals itself not in response to pressure, but in response to presence. And if you have ever watched someone struggle with something they have not yet admitted, then you understand that there is a moment when silence becomes heavier than confession. Over time, I could see the shift in Ethan more clearly. The way his movements became slightly more cautious, the way his tone carried a hint of distraction, the way he seemed to be thinking more than speaking, and I didn't need to ask what he was thinking about because I knew he was beginning to understand that what had been taken was not forgotten. And as I sat there that afternoon, watching him move through the house with that quiet unease settling into his steps, I realized that I had reached a point where the next step would not be about discovery. It would be about revelation, because the truth was no longer something hidden. It was something waiting to be acknowledged. And I knew with a calm certainty that had taken days to form, that moment was very close. The moment didn't arrive with a confession, not in the way one might expect, but through a quiet unraveling that became impossible to ignore. And over the next day or two, I began to see the weight of it settle more heavily on Ethan, not in anything he said directly, but in the small, unguarded moments when his composure slipped just enough to reveal what he was carrying. And I didn't realize it at the time, but this was the part where truth begins to surface, not through words, but through presence. He became more restless, moving through the house with a kind of distracted energy that hadn't been there before, and I noticed how he lingered less in shared spaces, how he avoided sitting too long in one place, as though stillness made it harder for him to avoid what was on his mind. And there is something about that kind of unease that tells you more than any explanation ever could. But that wasn't the worst part. What unsettled me most was not his behavior, but the quiet understanding that had settled within me. The realization that this was no longer a question of whether he had taken the jewelry, but of when he would be able to face it. And that shift changed everything, because it meant I was no longer searching for answers. I was waiting for acknowledgement. One evening, as we sat together in the living room, the television playing softly in the background, there was a silence between us that felt different from the others we had shared, not empty, but full of something unspoken, and I could sense that he was aware of it too, that he was sitting with the same understanding, even if he had not yet found the words to express it. I spoke then, not directly about the jewelry, not yet, but about something close enough to it that the meaning could not be mistaken. And I told him gently about how important it is to be able to come back from a mistake, how sometimes the hardest part is not what we've done, but admitting it. And as I spoke, I kept my tone calm, steady, not accusing, not confrontational, just present. He didn't respond immediately, and I could see the tension in his posture, the way he shifted slightly, as though the words had reached a place he had been trying to avoid. And for a moment, I wondered if he would say something, if this would be the moment everything came into the open. But instead, he nodded quietly, offering a simple acknowledgement that carried more weight than it appeared to on the surface. Over time, that moment stayed with him. I could see it in the way he moved afterward, the way his attention seemed divided, as though part of him was still sitting in that conversation, still turning those words over in his mind. And I realized then that what I had done was not to confront him, but to give him a way back, a path toward something that required courage rather than defense. The following morning, I noticed something different, not in anything obvious, but in the way he approached me, the way he lingered just slightly longer than usual, as though there was something he wanted to say but had not yet found the words for. And I didn't push him, because I understood that forcing the moment would only make it harder for him to take that step on his own. Sometimes I wonder how many people carry truths they are afraid to speak, not because they don't want to, but because they don't know how they will be received. And I realized that what I was offering him, without saying it directly, was not just the opportunity to admit what had happened, but the reassurance that doing so would not destroy everything. And as I sat there later that day, the quiet of the house settling around me once again, I felt a sense of calm that I hadn't expected, not because everything had been resolved, but because I knew with a certainty that had grown stronger with each passing moment, that the truth was no longer something hidden between us. It was simply waiting for him to say it. The confession didn't come in a single clear sentence, not at first, but in fragments, in hesitation, in the quiet struggle of someone trying to find the courage to say something they wish had never needed to be said. And I remember the exact moment it began, not because of what he said, but because of the way he stood in the doorway of the living room, unsure whether to step in or turn away. And I didn't realize it at the time, but that hesitation carried more truth than any words that would follow. I looked up at him calmly, not calling him over, not asking what he needed, simply allowing the moment to exist without pressure. And after a few seconds that felt longer than they should have, he walked in slowly, sitting across from me in a way that suggested he had already decided he could not avoid this any longer. And there was something in his expression, something unguarded, that told me everything before he even began to speak. He started carefully, not with the truth itself, but with something close to it, speaking about how things hadn't been going well, how he had made some bad decisions, how he had gotten himself into a situation he didn't know how to fix. And I listened without interrupting, because I understood that this was not just about admitting what he had done. It was about admitting who he had become in that moment. And that is often the harder truth to face. But that wasn't the worst part. What made it heavier, what made it real, was the moment when his voice shifted, when the careful distance in his words disappeared, and he finally said it plainly, that he had taken the jewelry, that he had sold it, and that he had told himself he would replace it before I ever noticed. And as those words settled into the room, there was a silence that followed, that felt both expected and deeply significant. I didn't respond immediately, not because I didn't know what to say, but because I wanted the moment to exist fully, without rushing past it, without softening it too quickly. And I let the truth sit there between us, allowing him to feel the weight of what he had said, not as punishment, but as acknowledgement, because some things need to be felt before they can be understood. Over time, he continued speaking, explaining the situation he had found himself in, the financial pressure, the poor choices, the belief that he could fix it quietly without involving anyone else. And I could hear the regret in his voice, not just for what he had done, but for the way he had done it, the secrecy, the assumption that it could be undone without consequence, and that regret, though it did not erase anything, carried a sincerity that was difficult to ignore. I told him then, gently but clearly, that the jewelry itself mattered less than what it represented, that those pieces were part of a history, part of a trust that had been built over years, and that what hurt most was not the loss, but the decision to take it without speaking to me, without giving me the chance to understand or help. And as I spoke, I could see the weight of that realization settle more deeply into him. There were no raised voices, no anger, no dramatic confrontation, just a quiet exchange of truth that felt heavier than anything else could have been. And I realized then that sometimes the most powerful moments are not the ones filled with emotion, but the ones grounded in clarity, where everything is seen exactly as it is, without distortion. And as we sat there, the silence returning in a different way now, no longer filled with uncertainty, but with understanding, I knew that this was not the end of the situation, not the resolution, but something else entirely. It was the turning point, the moment where what had been hidden was now fully visible, and whatever came next would be shaped not by what had been done, but by how we chose to move forward from it. After Ethan spoke those words, after the truth had finally settled into the space between us without anything left to hide behind, there was a stillness that felt different from anything we had shared before, not heavy with uncertainty, but grounded in something more real, something that could no longer be avoided or reshaped. And I sat there quietly, allowing that moment to fully exist, because I understood that what came next mattered just as much as what had already been said. I didn't respond immediately, not out of hesitation, but out of intention, because I wanted my words to carry clarity rather than reaction. And when I finally spoke, my voice remained calm, steady, not distant, but not softened by avoidance either. And I told him that while I appreciated his honesty, the truth alone did not resolve what had been done. It simply made it possible to begin addressing it. But that wasn't the most important part. What mattered was what I chose to do next, because I had already decided, long before this moment arrived, that I would not allow this to become something that was quietly forgiven and forgotten, not out of punishment, but because doing so would diminish the meaning of what had been taken, and I needed him to understand that actions carry consequences, not to create distance, but to restore balance. I explained to him clearly and without raising my voice that the jewelry would need to be accounted for, not necessarily replaced in the exact form it once existed, because some things cannot be recovered in that way, but acknowledged in a way that reflected its value both financially and emotionally. And I told him that this would not be something he could resolve alone, quietly as he had intended, but something that required responsibility in a way he had not yet taken. Over time, as I spoke, I could see something shift in him. Not resistance, not defensiveness, but a quiet acceptance, the kind that comes when a person understands that they are being held accountable not out of anger, but out of respect for what has been lost. And I realized then that this was the difference between reacting and responding, between allowing the moment to pass and shaping it into something that carries meaning. I told him that I would be involved in the process moving forward, that whatever steps needed to be taken would be done openly, with full awareness, and that trust, once broken, is not restored through promises, but through consistent action over time. And those words, though simple, carried a weight that settled deeply into the conversation. There was no argument, no attempt to justify what had already been admitted, just a quiet agreement that what needed to be done would be done, and I could see in his expression that this was not the outcome he had feared, but perhaps something more difficult in its own way, because it required him to remain present in the situation, to face it fully rather than escape it. As the conversation came to a close, I felt something settle within me, not relief, not satisfaction, but a steady sense of alignment, as though I had responded in a way that honored both the truth of the situation and the person I had become over the years. And I realized that this was not about reclaiming what had been taken in a physical sense. It was about reclaiming the space in which I could no longer be quietly overlooked. And as Ethan sat there, quieter now, more grounded in the reality of what had unfolded, I understood that this moment, though difficult, carried something important within it, not just for him, but for me as well, because it marked a shift from silence to clarity, from uncertainty to intention, and whatever came next would not be shaped by what had been hidden, but by what had finally been brought into the open. Because sometimes the most meaningful form of strength is not in what you say, but in how clearly you choose to stand in what you know to be right. In the days that followed, life did not return to what it had been before, and in many ways I was grateful for that, because what had existed before had allowed something important to go unnoticed, something that needed to be seen, understood, and addressed. And as I moved through my days with a quiet steadiness, I realized that resolution does not always come in the form of restoration. Sometimes it comes in the form of clarity. Ethan began to change in small but noticeable ways, not dramatically, not all at once, but with a consistency that suggested he was beginning to understand the weight of what had happened, and I saw it in the way he approached me, more mindful, more present, no longer avoiding conversations or retreating into silence when something felt difficult. And while those changes did not erase the past, they marked the beginning of something more honest than what had existed before. We spoke often in the weeks that followed, not just about what had happened, but about everything that had led to it, the choices, the pressure, the quiet assumptions that had allowed him to believe he could fix things without involving anyone else, And I listened, not to excuse, but to understand, because I had come to realize that understanding does not weaken accountability. It strengthens it. But that wasn't the most important part. What mattered most was how I began to see the situation as a whole, not as a single act of betrayal, but as a moment that revealed something deeper, something that had been building quietly beneath the surface. And I understood that while I could not change what had been done, I could shape what it meant moving forward. I took steps to ensure that everything in my life was clearer, more structured, more protected, not out of fear, but out of awareness. And I reviewed my finances, my belongings, my decisions, making sure that nothing remained uncertain or unspoken. And those actions, though practical, carried a deeper meaning for me, because they represented a commitment to myself, a promise that I would no longer rely solely on assumption where clarity was needed. Over time, the house began to feel settled again, not in the same way it had before, but in a way that felt more grounded, more real. And I found a kind of quiet peace in that, not because everything was perfect, but because everything was understood. And there is a certain comfort in truth, even when it arrives through difficult moments. Ethan followed through on what we had discussed, taking responsibility in a way that required effort, patience, and consistency. And while the jewelry itself could never be fully replaced in meaning, the actions he took began to rebuild something else, something more important than objects. A sense of accountability that had not been there before. There were evenings when I would sit by the window, the same place where I had once held that empty box in my hands, and I would reflect on everything that had happened, not with bitterness or regret, but with a quiet understanding that life continues to teach us, even in its later chapters, and that sometimes the lessons we never expected to face are the ones that shape us most deeply. At this stage in life, I have learned that trust is not something that remains untouched by time or circumstance. It is something that must be seen clearly, protected thoughtfully, and restored carefully when it is broken. And while that process is not always easy, it is always meaningful when approached with honesty. And as I sit here now, years later, I no longer think of that moment as the day something was taken from me, because in truth, it was the day something was revealed, not just about Ethan, but about myself, about my ability to face something difficult without losing who I am. And sometimes that is the most valuable thing we can ever hold on to, because in the end, it is not what we lose that defines us, but how clearly we choose to stand in what remains.